Competitive Pokemon has been around since the late 90s, and it's only grown in popularity since then. That means that across these 9, soon to be 10 generations, there has been a lot of room for misconceptions to form. So I'm going to try to give my best and honest opinion and clear some of them up, starting with what makes something ban-worthy. If you ask the majority of players whether something is considered ban-worthy or not, they'd probably look at the usage rate first and foremost, but often they don't really consider much else. Whether a Pokemon is ban-worthy or not is based on a lot more than just a usage rate. And in my personal opinion, a usage rate doesn't have as much of an importance as most people think that it does. Now, a Pokemon having a high usage rate isn't bad at all. Centralization is a natural and healthy part of the metagame. It means that there are certain Pokemon that are reliable enough to be on a majority of teams. If there were no form of centralization, and there were 30 Pokemon who all had the same level of viability, it would be far too hard to team build. Basically, and don't take this out of context, there is such a thing as having too much diversity. In my opinion, what makes a Pokemon ban-worthy is if it's unhealthy for the game. And by that, I mean 2 things. Number 1, there are no checks or counters for it, or no reliable checks or counters for it. And 2, it's uncompetitive. The first one is simple, a lack of answers. Let's look at a very recent case, Miraidon. Miraidon took a while to finally get banned, and one of the main reasons was that there were no good answers for it. For example, Tinglu. It could tank a Draco Meteor, and obviously because of its ground typing, was immune to Electro Drift, but lacks reliable recovery, so it couldn't take hits forever. Clodsire cannot reliably tank Draco Meteor either, only Electro Drift, and most Pokemon in general just couldn't deal with it. And that's the thing, people were using Tinglu to counter Miraidon. I don't even mean Tinglu is a bad Pokemon. Tinglu is definitely good, but it's not super commonly used. It can be used on hazard teams, yes, hazard stacks particularly, but once Miraidon was banned, it was used much less. And that's the thing. A mark of a Pokemon that should be banned is when you're being forced to run Pokemon you would never really use otherwise. This Reddit comment kind of sums it up. Thank God. No more forced Tinglus and Iron Shreds on all my teams because I'm a bad player who cannot play against that freaking bicycle. Let's rejoice. Although he says he's a bad player, it was really everyone that was kind of struggling to deal with Miraidon. Tinglu and Iron Shreds are both OU Pokemon. You wouldn't really use otherwise, really. When you're forced, and I mean forced, to look beyond the tier that you're playing in to find a reliable check and counter, you know a Pokemon is overpowered. It's very reminiscent of how Pokemon were using Quagsire to deal with Zacian. Being able to take down and defend yourself from Miraidon's attacks took far too much of a toll on the team building process. The sheer presence of Miraidon was so overwhelming that people actually started running Grass Arceus. Grass Arceus. Freaking Grass Arceus, isn't that insane? It took a while for people to realize that, because at first it looked like it wasn't that much of a problem. And I'd argue the reason for that is just that everyone wanted to use Miraidon, so they didn't want to admit that it was broken, / because everyone was using Miraidon, they couldn't exactly tell if it was broken or not. It's sort of a similar situation as Garchomp in DBP OU. For a long time, back in 2005-ish, a lot of people didn't want to ban Garchomp, and it wasn't because it wasn't ban-worthy, it was just because everyone wanted to use Garchomp, so nobody wanted to say, hey, I think this Pokemon is completely overpowered and is making this game uncompetitive. Eventually, though, it was banned, thank God. Now we just have to ban Jirachi, but besides that, that's a similar situation. The second factor is it being uncompetitive. This is pretty simple. The reason Pokemon is a fun, competitive game, emphasis on the competitive, at least most of the time, is because it's based mostly on skill. That's why OHKO moves are banned. It's not because they're completely broken, they have super low accuracy, but it's because they remove the skill factor of the game. It becomes a luck-based game instead. That's also why Pokemon like Machamp was banned, even though it took 2 decades. Let's take a look at that. Machamp was never unbeatable. He wasn't even ranked S or A in the viability rankings, and his usage rate was not particularly impressive. At one point, it had a usage rate of about 12%. So why did it get banned? Well, it was because of Dynamic Punch. It has 50% accuracy, but thanks to Machamp's ability and no guard, he could never miss. Therefore, Dynamic Punch had 100% accuracy. And in Generation 4, Confusion has 50% chance to cause soft damage. That's where the RNG aspect comes in. You're essentially just spamming Dynamic Punch, hoping for a coin flip. And even if you resist fighting type moves, you can still get confused. It's not based on skill anymore. It's just glorified gambling, which I know a lot of people say Pokemon is just glorified gambling, but now it's just really like you're going to a casino. A high usage rate doesn't necessarily indicate that a Pokemon should be banned. For example, a Pokemon can have a high usage rate and still have many counters. Let's take Tyranitar for example, specifically in Gen 3OU. It currently has a 67% usage rate in Gen 3OU. However, he has a lot of variety in his sets, plenty of checks, walls, or offensive threats that can scare him away, such as Dugtrio, Metagross, or certain fire types. The biggest factor in whether a Pokemon should be banned or not is if its existence to its tier prevents Pokemon from being a skill-based game. That being said, it makes no sense to me that Machamp is banned, but Jirachi isn't. Anyways, now on to Generation 2. Gen 2 has a reputation for being a stall-oriented gen. That's because of a few factors. Number 1, maxed out stats. Generation 1 and 2 were the only gens where you could max out all of your stats. That means there were no natures and mixed attackers were more common. But more importantly, Pokemon were much bulkier. For example, Tyranitar's Stab Rock Slide in Generation 2 does 41.1 to 48.6% damage to Jolteon, but in Generation 3, a Jolly, not even Adamant, a Jolly Nature Tyranitar does 65.8 to 77.5% damage. That is a huge difference and illustrates how much harder it was to get Okos or just KOs in Generation 2 because Pokemon are bulkier. And that is on a frail Pokemon like Jolteon. Imagine how much more insufferable it is when you're dealing with Pokemon that already have pre-existing bulk, like Blissey and Snorlax. Next is items. Items were finally introduced in Generation 2, but the only item that saw widespread use was leftovers, other than a few niche options. Most Pokemon ran leftovers, which recovers 1/16 of your total HP per turn. This added even more to the general bulkiness of Pokemon. Next is spikes and recovery loops. Another pivotal addition was spikes. Because Pokemon were bulkier, it was harder to make progress. So much so that in some guides, if you search Introduction to Competitive Pokemon GSC, there is a section literally titled, How Do I Kill Pokemon? Because yeah, it's kind of hard. It seems like it's really difficult to get damage. Many Pokemon ran that rest plus sleep talk combo, which also made them hard to wear down. So yeah, Generation 2 battles are often really long and grindy. But here's the key point. Generation 2 isn't actually stall. Let's define stall. Stall is a playstyle where your main way of beating Pokemon is by whittling them down through mostly non-damaging moves, walling out attackers and stalling them out via recovery or power point depletion. If Generation 2 is truly a stall generation, then most commonly used teams would be full stall. That's not true at all. Let's look at the top 10 most used Pokemon in GSCOU. We have Snorlax, Zapdos, Cloyster, Fortress, Tyranitar, Gengar, Raikou, Golem, Exeggutor, and Starmie. Out of those 10, only Fortress can really be considered a Stallmon. Every other Pokemon here is fairly standard offensive pick. Cloyster and Fortress are the only ones that aren't super offensively inclined most times. Cloyster's main function being as a spiker and a spitter, and Fortress as well. But the rest are either phasers, curse sweepers, or explosion users. Even if we extend the list further, there are only maybe 3 Pokemon that can be reasonably called Stallmon in the top 20-ish Pokemon. A lot of the others are confused for Stallmon simply because they're naturally bulky, and again, because of the reasons I mentioned, battles seem to go longer. But that doesn't make them Blissey. This is a misconception based mostly on the fact that Gen 2 feels like Stall because the games are a lot longer and it's not a super fun generation to play, and Stall isn't exactly a fun thing to play against. But it isn't actually Stall at its core. Those were some of my opinions on common misconceptions. Feel free to comment if you disagree.
Yeah.